This kit's been in my pile of shame for a while now, and I don't have the time or space to build the full station. But the kit comes with these two smaller models, which are the Defiant, and a Cardassian ship that you can build either into a Galor-class or a Keldon-class warship. Even better though, because the Defiant comes on a sprue with this piece, and because the station needs 3 of these pieces, you actually get 3 Defiants. I'm only going to be using 1 in this build, but it's good to know that I have spares for later use. You also get a giant sheet of decals to use with both ships, which takes out some of the tedium of painting. The Defiant comes in clear, just like the station, but the Keldon-class comes in this slightly opaque white, which, as usual, forces me to turn down my camera's exposure, so you can actually see the thing. The diorama I want to make needs 2 Cardassian ships though, so I found a model online and 3D printed it. The detail on the print is surprisingly great, even for FDM, and you'll see in a minute that any imperfections won't be that big of a deal. The plan is to arrange the ships roughly like this as engaged in a battle, with the 3D printed ship in the middle where it's going to be mid-explosion. And you can see from this clip of Sacrifice of Angels what each ship's phases look like, and we'll be adding those in too. To start, I drilled out the holes for mounting rods. They'll also be used later to route wires. Each ship also gets an airbrushing of their base color ahead of applying the decals. And at the last minute I remember to apply a gloss coat before applying the decals. The gloss coat gives a smooth surface for the decals to adhere to, and it reduces the chances of bubbles getting stuck underneath and ruining the appearance. You can buy specific gloss varnishes from hobby stores and whatnot, but an old modelling trick is just to use future floor polish. You can spray it through the airbrush neat, and it's self-leveling and only needs a couple of coats. Next, it's the slower but satisfying process to apply the decals, and I use microset and microsol on each segment. Microset helps the decals to adhere to the model surface. Then once it's dry, microsol softens the decal paper, which helps it conform to all the bumps and crevices and makes everything look painted on. Some pieces take 4 or 5 coats of microsol to look right, and I start out by working on one small section at a time. But before long, I switch over to getting all the decals on the model first, and then work on much larger sections with the microsol, and this is much faster. The result speaks for themselves. The roll's still shiny here, but by the end I'll hit it with a matte varnish, and it's that matte varnish that'll make it all look perfect. Before painting the Defiant though, I added some masking gel over a few areas that I want to have lit up, so the first step here is to remove that. It took up a bit too much of the base coat paint in some places, but touching up this battle damage is easy enough. To me, a clear paints are added to the inside so that a single white LED will light up everything as needed. I then added a couple of coats of black to the inside just to help with light blocking. The Keldon's phaser effect is just a long filament LED. I run the positive wire up through the hollow brass tube, and later on, I'll run a solid brass rod through the diorama's base to connect to the negative terminal. And at this point, all the pieces of the Keldon model can be pushed together. The Defiant's LEDs are a little trickier, both because there's two of them, but mostly because the space to fit them in is much smaller. I initially tried pre-wiring the LEDs and resistor, but that ended up way too thick to pass through the hollow rod. So after some really annoying futzing around, I managed to hot glue the two LEDs in place, and then somehow solder the circuit together to fit inside the tiny model. The resistor was added later on the other side of the brass rod. Before adding the remaining decals, I used some half-dry putty to fill in the critical seams, which were then sanded smooth and painted over. The Keldon also gets a few final details painted brown and orange before I apply the matte varnish. I'm using this wooden frame for the base and I spray it black. If I ever do this again, I'll either use a hand brush or an airbrush with a much more matte black paint, because the spray can is just way too glossy. Even after applying numerous layers of matte varnish, nothing helped. To add some detail, I dab on white stars, then airbrush a nebula made from light passes of blue and purple. It's hard to see on camera, but it's there and it isn't intended to be all that prominent anyway. Next, we mount the two completed models and use copious amounts of hot glue to lock in their position and rotation. One tip when applying this much hot glue is to do it in smaller amounts, so that each application doesn't take 5 minutes to harden. Also be aware that when you apply a second layer of hot glue, it has a chance of reactivating the glue beneath it. This is also the point that I can add the negative end to the Keldon's phaser fire. The most exciting part of this build was to make the exploding Galor-class ship, and printing it in two halves like this really came in handy. I also airbrushed in some brown lines to make the surface a bit more interesting. The general plan is to break it up into several large sections, while still keeping it recognizable. There also needs to be room for another LED and some cotton balls for smoke effects. I thought this Gorilla Glue gel might work well to weld together 3D printed parts, but I had to fall back to the regular old crazy glue, which thankfully I'd recently just bought some new tubes of. A small segment of paperclip helps the bridge to float in place above the main body. And I'm really happy with the state of my exploding ship. And to really sell the exploding effect, here's the orange LED and some cotton balls. Teasing out the cotton balls makes wispy clouds which, when pulled thin enough, glow orange from the LED below. It takes a bit of back and forth, and some white glue to hold things in place. But it's actually pretty easy to get something that looks good this way. I also make sure the ship is mounted in a different way to the Keldon-class, just to make the diorama feel a bit more dynamic. And finally I can wire up a switch and a USB power supply. I'd originally planned to add the phaser cannon effects for the Defiant, but after putting it all together and seeing it switched on, there's already just so much light from the other LEDs. Plus, from the angle of the ships, the diorama should read as the Defiant having just fired on the Galor-class ship anyway. And here are the beauty shots. As always, thanks for watching to the end. I really do appreciate all the support. And if you like what I'm doing here, I'd really appreciate if you'd subscribe and join me on my YouTube journey. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.